Okay, this is lesson 2, the first English colonies, and remember this will go on your right-hand side. The first permanent English settlement in the New World was in 1607 in Jamestown, which is in Virginia. The colonists at first were very unsuccessful, but eventually they were able to capitalize on the tobacco craze. They grew rich from building tobacco plantations, and they were primarily single men who were looking for fortunes who originally settled in Jamestown. The Pilgrims came in 1620 in Massachusetts, present-day Massachusetts. They set up a plan for self-government and democracy known as the Mayflower Compact. They made it on board the Mayflower, the ship they took to the New World. And in 1630, the larger group of settlers settled in Massachusetts. They were the Puritans in 1630. Both the Pilgrims and the Puritans tended to come as family units, and they had come to seek freedom from religious persecution. And when you come as a family unit, you tend to be more permanently settled, right? So they're gonna establish towns, they're gonna establish businesses. They planned on staying here in the New World. That was not necessarily the case of everybody who went to Jamestown. Many people went to Jamestown in search of fortune, and many of them thought, hey, if I get a fortune, I might go back to England. So these are the first English colonies in North America. Why did they come? Well, settlers came for a variety of reasons. English settlers came from a variety of reasons. Many did escape religious persecution, right? The Puritans, the Pilgrims, some Catholics, some Jews later on, Quakers. They would be groups of people who were fleeing Europe because of the persecution. Many of them desired land. They were poor. They were desperate. They were looking for any way out of Europe, and the New World offered all this new land that they might be able to farm or get a little piece of and start their life fresh. Many of them were indentured servants who, in return for the passage to the New World, these servants promised to work for 7 years for the landowner. Many of these indentured servants ended up in the South, right? Because the plantations, the tobacco plantations, needed so many laborers, that indentured servants were a possibility. All right, they were an easy resource to use as a plantation worker. Many came for a better life. All right, a lot of that even today, right? People come here for a better way of life, but many were forced. The transatlantic slave trade would pick up in the 1680s, and many settlers, I guess you'd call them, slaves, would be forced here against their will. So here's a map of transatlantic slave trade, and I know we talked about it the other day in class, but between 10 and 15 million Africans would be removed from the African continent and brought to the New World, all right, to the Western Hemisphere. And they primarily left from these eastern Atlantic coast regions of Africa. And as you can see, 5 million ended up in Brazil, another 500,000 in the western side of South America, about 0.2 million in Central America, 4.5 million in the West Indies, and about 500,000 to English North America, New York, Richmond, Charleston, and so on. So what would often happen is this was the area of the greatest slave trade. All right, this was the area of the greatest need for slaves. It was the West Indies. It was the Caribbean. That's where sugar plantations were propping up. Sugar was making people lots of money, but it was very, very dangerous work, right? Cotton plantations, it was hot. It was miserable. People didn't live long. So they needed to continually resupply that region with African slaves. And so they would sell them here. Any of the slaves that were not sold in the West Indies, the slave traders would move up along the coast before they went back to Europe, and they tried to sell their slaves in English North America. Okay? Economic life in the English colonies. It was largely based on providing resources for Europe. All right? There wasn't a lot of manufacturing going on. Northerners tended to be involved in lumbering and timber and that kind of thing, and Southerners in plantation agriculture. Our prosperity here in the New World was based on trade, primarily triangular trade, and primarily with Britain, with England. All right, so our colonies were very much dependent on the British Isles. So here's an example of triangular trade. They would load up sugar, tobacco, later on cotton maybe, here in North America. That ship would be full. It would go to Europe. It would unload. It would fill up with textiles, rums, and other manufactured goods that were made in Europe. They'd go down to Africa, trade for slaves, fill the ship up with slaves now, and back. The ships could never remain empty. They always had to have something on board because they were losing money unless they did that. So this is a map to show that kind of triangular trade. All right, so these are the 13 English colonies in the New World, okay? And they're divided up into 3 sections for our purposes. You had New England, which included Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and what would eventually become Maine. You had the middle colonies, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And then you had the southern colonies, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. And as you can see, the English colonies in the New World, they really weren't that expansive because it was very difficult. You had the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Appalachian Mountains on the other. So they kind of was squeezed along the coast there. And our question today revolves around these 3 regions. So you have 3 regions: New England, Middle, and Southern. This chart or graph shows the economies, the differences between the colonies. Remember, they were all of English origin. For the most part, everyone who lived there was of English origin. Sure, there's exceptions to that rule, but for the most part. So they all spoke English. They had English traditions. They were, if you think about it, they were migrants from England to North America. Okay? In the New England colonies, they tended to have more family units like we talked about. They were involved in selling dried fish, whale oil, livestock, wood products. All right. Middle colonies, these are the breadbasket colonies. Long Island was a breadbasket, produced a lot of wheat. So a lot of grain is produced in these middle colonies. As you can see, 73% of their exports were grain. And a lot of that came from Long Island, upstate New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. All right. And in the southern colonies, you have tobacco and rice. And you're going to have slavery, okay? Because these are cash crops. They're plantation crops. They're not family-run farms for the most part. They are plantations. The only way you could make money is if you had these type of cash crops. There are some grains, as you can see down here, 13%, but the majority, 68% of the economy, was based on exporting cash crops, and that's why slavery took hold in the South. And this is just a little graphic to kind of show you what we're talking about here, right? You see all the tobacco in the southern colonies, some in the middle there. And then you have the wheat and corn, primarily in these areas. Cattle, rum, right? Up here you have shipbuilding as an export. And so what we're going to ask you is about these 3 areas. And one other thing I just want to mention is the Appalachian Mountains right along here. All right, so again, that was their boundary or their barrier to expanding west. There was these Appalachians, so they kind of squeezed along this area here, these 13 colonies. So that's it. All right, now we're just going to move on to the left-hand side. So our left-hand side is you're going to use the presentation and the last 3 slides, okay, the maps and the chart. And you're going to answer this question. Which of the 3 colonial regions would you have settled in? New England, Middle, or Southern, and why? So remember, your response has to have a claim. So it has to answer the question, I would have settled in New England because. I would have settled in New England. And now the because is the reasoning. The reasons I would have settled there is this and this. And give specific detail from the presentations and the maps. All right. If you have any questions, you can contact us through the Remind or through email. And this goes in your notebooks as number 2.